Hi everyone, so this will be our next video in our series on the respiratory system. So this is volume 4. Just a quick reminder, last time when we kind of ended up with volume 3, we were talking about blood gas transport, the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and then a little bit about some issues associated when carbon dioxide levels rise. So just a quick recap, when carbon dioxide levels increase, it's going to increase the amount of hydrogen ions present, which will decrease our pH. To adjust for that, we would want to blow off the excess CO2 if possible. If we can get rid of some of the carbon dioxide, we can reduce the amount of hydrogen ions produced and bring the pH back up and correct for acidosis. How can we blow off excess CO2? As we can hyperventilate. Okay, when you ventilate, you're passing air over your respiratory medium, which is your alveoli. If we're hyperventilating it, we're increasing it. We're increasing our rate and depth of breathing. We're increasing our ventilation rate with the goal of blowing off excess carbon dioxide and adjusting our pH back to its homeostatic set point. Okay, so the respiratory system provides a fast-acting system to make adjustments to pH that may have been disturbed by other metabolic factors, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so let's talk a little about how your respiration rate and how breathing is controlled. So let's talk about control. Every process in your body has some sort of mechanism of control over it, and so respiration is no exception. The main area of control over respiration in your brain is a group of neurons. Actually, there's 2 of them. The DRG, and I'm simplifying this, and the VRG. These are in the medulla. The DRG is dorsal respiratory group, and the VRG is ventral respiratory group. So have to remember the terms dorsal and ventral from AMP1. So this is located globally in the medulla, okay? These are groups of neurons. That have the capability of stimulating our phrenic nerve. So they can stimulate the phrenic nerve, which in turn will stimulate your diaphragm. The little plus sign we're just using to indicate stimulate. So when these neurons fire, they're going to stimulate the phrenic nerve to innervate or stimulate your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles, so we can change our thoracic cavity volume and take a breath in. Okay, this is your pacemaker. This sets your rate and depth of breathing for you. So remember, this is completely involuntary. You can override it, of course, but it is an involuntary system that controls your diaphragm so that you don't have to consciously tell yourself to take a breath at every few minutes, etc. Okay? Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to sleep. This is going to set your rate of breathing at about 12 to 15 respiratory cycles per minute, okay? If a patient is in a state of hypoxia, which means you have low oxygen, the DRG and the VRG can then initiate gasping for air, okay? Which is interesting when we think about what happens to people when they're drowning. If these neurons are suppressed, then inspiration, breathing in, stops. So anything that would depress this part of your central nervous system could potentially then suppress breathing, which is very dangerous. So what types of things do that? Alcohol. Remember, alcohol is a central nervous system depressant. Morphine. Okay. Morphine is an exogenous, meaning it's coming from the outside. It's an exogenous opiate. So Morphine is used to treat pain, as most opiates are. But one of the dangers, of course, with opiates is because they can suppress this part of the central nervous system, that someone who overdoses on opiates would kind of pass out, kind of knock out, and then they would stop breathing. And that's exactly what happens when somebody overdoses on heroin. What something like Narcan does is it strips heroin and other opiates off of the opioid receptor in your brain, and that allows you to kind of wake up very quickly. But because a person who's been administered Narcan kind of is disorientated, they often wake up kind of not knowing where they are, angry, and quite violent. Okay, in addition to the DRG and the VRG, you also have what's called your Pontine Center. So we think Pontine, pons. And remember, the medulla and the pons in the brain, we're next door neighbors. The Pontine Center is going to influence the action of your medullary center. So it will fine tune your inspiration so that's kind of smooth, and your expiration so that's kind of smooth, and it's not choppy. It also works with a reflex action called the Hering-Brewer reflex that will help prevent overinflation and overstretching of the lungs. Okay, other factors so this really controls your breathing, okay? Obviously, you can override that normal rate and depth of breathing that you would experience. So for example, if you sigh, if you yawn, hiccuping, okay, those are interrupting normal patterns of breathing. So let's talk about some of the other factors that would influence your normal rate and depth of breathing, okay? So other factors that could kind of influence breathing. What are the types of things that perhaps interrupt our normal rate and depth of breathing? So some of them you could kind of guess. So the first thing that would interrupt your normal breathing would be something, perhaps a pulmonary irritant. Okay, you inhale something that is an irritant to your pulmonary system, and that might result in you reflexively coughing, for example. You also have an inhalation reflex. Our inhalation reflex, or the Hering-Brewer reflex, is designed to prevent overinflation of the lungs. So you want to take your breath in, and then you would have baroreceptors. So we think think like barometer, barometric pressure. A baroreceptor can detect pressure. So as you're inhaling, the pressure inside the lungs is going to build a little bit as they expand, right? So you're going to push out. These receptors will detect that you've inflated to the point that it's appropriate, and that will send a signal up to your medulla to influence and say, that's enough. Okay, so we don't overinflate the lungs. Other areas that can influence your rate and depth of breathing, your hypothalamus, which I'll abbreviate HDH. For example, signals from the hypothalamus can speak to those medullary areas and kind of send different messages to tell them to change your rate and depth of breathing. So I'll give you an example. Your hypothalamus, remember, controls temperature. So for example, when someone has a fever, you will increase rate. You will increase the rate and depth of breathing. You will breathe faster. So if you have an increase in body temperature, you'll increase your respiratory rate. Cortical centers. Areas of your cerebral cortex can also help to override the normal medullary actions in your brain. For example, if I said to someone to take a deep breath, you could forcibly inhale deeply and go, that overrides your normal rate and depth of breathing, but as soon as you breathe out, the normal rate and depth of breathing will pick right back up. All right, another factor that will influence your rate and depth of breathing are chemical factors. So you have what are called chemoreceptors. And And again, a receptor is going to receive information, a chemoreceptor is going to receive a chemical signal. What the signal is, we don't know, but there's going to be some chemical signal that a certain receptor will pick up and then provide information back to the brain. So, what we really care about in this case is our blood gases, right? So we can look at what's our level of carbon dioxide, which kind of we can check in on with pH and oxygen. So you have two sets of chemoreceptors. You have a set in your brain, and you have a set in the carotid and aortic bodies. Those are peripheral. The one in your brain is called your central chemoreceptors. The ones in the periphery are in two spots. So remember, when your carotid artery bifurcates, you have your common carotids in your neck, and then it bifurcates to internal and external carotid arteries. So something like this, when I say bifurcates, it splits like a Y. Right here at the bifurcation of the carotid artery, that's where one set of your peripheral chemoreceptors is located. It's called the carotid bodies. Another set is in the aorta, just as in the aortic arch, as it kind of makes that turn before it becomes a descending aorta and descends down through the thoracic cavity. There's another set of peripheral chemoreceptors there, and that's called the aortic bodies. What these are doing is constantly relaying information about certain blood gases and pH back to the medulla so that you can influence and change your rate and depth of breathing as appropriate. So let's talk about the last factor that can influence rate and depth of breathing. And then we'll talk about how the different blood gases can we'll get drilled down a little bit further on that. The last factor that can influence your rate and depth of breathing is, of course, exercise. When you're doing aerobic exercise, your rate and depth of breathing should be geared to the intensity and duration of whatever exercise you're doing. Generally speaking, ventilation is going to increase as you begin exercise to combat a few things. One, you have to get more oxygen. So by increasing your ventilation rate, you'll be able to take more oxygen in, but also you have to dump more CO2. That's being generated as you're exercising. Remember, as you're using oxygen for the purposes of aerobic respiration, the more oxygen you're using for that, the more carbon dioxide waste you're generating as well. What's going to happen, your arterial blood gas levels will remain pretty constant, but what will happen is venous blood gas levels will change. Okay, your arterial blood gas levels should not change much. That doesn't make much sense, but your venous blood gas levels should change just a little bit. You would really want to see them almost completely devoid and depleted of oxygen and loaded up with CO2. That's telling us that the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen at the level of the tissue is appropriate and is matching the exercise that you're doing, okay? Remember, your muscle tissue is a voracious energy hog. It just absolutely loves oxygen. So when you're exercising, that demand and love for oxygen is only going to increase. All right, so let's talk about our blood gases and how our chemoreceptors are really checking on them and which is the most important. We all tend to get caught up very deeply in oxygen. We love oxygen, we need it, of course we do. But the more tightly controlled blood gas is actually carbon dioxide, okay? So this is the most potent activator of our chemoreceptors and the most tightly controlled, okay? So this is a tightly controlled homeostatic loop. You don't want variation, a significant variation, I should say, in the level of carbon dioxide in your bloodstream. And that is because if this changes, it can change pH, and that can be detrimental. So when carbon dioxide goes up, the chemoreceptors will send that signal to the medulla, and what should happen is you will hyperventilate. And there, What we're really trying to do is blow off that excess carbon dioxide, and it's really aimed at regulating your blood pH. In your brain, the central, your cerebrospinal fluid is not significantly buffered, so small changes in carbon dioxide and more particularly pH are noted immediately. Whereas in your blood plasma, you have bicarbonate to buffer against kind of wide swings in pH. Okay, we're talking about oxygen. Okay. The primary receptors for oxygen are in your carotid bodies, which makes sense. Because the carotid arteries, eventually the common will branch into internal and external, but they're really servicing different areas of the brain, okay? And your brain, your neurons, are really heavy hitters in terms of oxygen consumption. So if oxygen levels have changed even a little bit, your carotid arteries should really get the memo very, very quickly that there's something going on. Under normal conditions, the effects of a little bit of variations of oxygen is only slight. But if oxygen declines significantly, your carotid bodies will send a signal to the medulla, and the medulla will coordinate changing your rate and depth of breathing so that you increase your rate of oxygen intake. Okay. And the other thing we're really checking on and taking a look at is pH. And pH is very, very important for a couple of reasons. You have two kind of general reasons that pH can change. You have metabolic changes, and then we have respiratory